All right, go ahead and get started with the special senses. So we can divide our sensory input into two different categories. We can have general senses or we have special senses. Our general senses are going to be related to touch and pain and temperature, and these are widely distributed throughout the body, and they have receptors that are within other organs. So they can be either somatic or visceral. Whereas our special senses are specialized structures that are localized to specific regions or areas, and they have specialized nerve endings. And so we'll see that when we get to taste, light, sound, equilibrium, and smell. They have their special receptor cells that either receive chemical or light or like sound input, and they're specialized to those inputs, and then they send their signals on through sensory receptors. In the general senses, these are spread out widely throughout the body, such as in the skin or on the outsides of organs. So when we're talking about the general senses, like I said, we have somatic, which would be information on the body and the environment. So all these different aspects of feeling around you, such as touch, pain, pressure, vibration, temperature. Again, they're distributed widely throughout the body, and they provide sensory information on the body and its environment. But it does it similarly throughout all of the skin, which is an organ, and also the internal organs for visceral. So that's just pain and pressure. So when we're talking about some of the somatic general senses, we can have different types of receptors in the skin that receive different input from various stimuli, such as temperature, which could be like a free nerve ending, which would also receive pain. We have Merkel's discs and Meissner corpuscles that receive different types of touch, whether it be fine or deep touch, pressure. Hair follicle receptor receives touch when the hair is moved. Pacinian corpuscle, which receives vibration and pressure. And then Ruffini's ending, which will be responding to stretch in the skin. So these are all spread throughout your skin, some in more dense or more dense throughout different areas of the skin. Same thing with your organs. You'll still have free nerve endings as well as different touch receptors to see if they're being touched. But referred pain kind of covers the visceral sensations, which basically referred pain is pain that's perceived at a location other than the site of the painful stimulus or origin. All right, so it's the result of a network of interconnecting sensory fibers, and they supply multiple different tissues, such as the strong visceral sensations of the heart can be felt as pain in the left shoulder. So you can kind of see here, these are referred areas, so your heart is located here, but you could feel it in your shoulder based on the sensory fibers from the heart and your skin receptors on your shoulder entering them through the same dorsal root ganglion and then synapsing to the interneurons to go to the brain. And so it's perceived as an area of the skin that is hurting, but it's actually your heart. And so depending on the organ system that's affected, the referred pain will project to different areas of the body. So that's what all these little highlighted areas are. So the most broadly accepted theory for this is that the visceral sensory fibers enter into the same level of the spinal cord as the somatosensory fibers of the referred pain location. All right, so by this explanation, basically these visceral sensory fibers from the mediastinal region, the area that the heart is located, would enter the spinal cord at the same level as the spinal nerves from the shoulder or the arm, which the skin receptor would be in. So the brain misinterprets the sensations from the area where the heart would be as being from the axillary or brachial regions where the shoulder or arm are. So that's why people, when they're having a heart attack, usually feel it in their left shoulder or in their arm, sensation going down their arm, because the heart is being supplied through the same spinal root ganglion as areas of the arm would be. So that covers general senses, and now we can start getting into each category of the special senses. As you can see here, we have 5 different special senses. We have gustation, which would be taste. We have olfaction, which will be smell. Audition, which is hearing. Equilibrium, which is your balance. and then vision. And we'll get into each one of these more closely. So when it comes to gustation, we have your tongue and your mouth that are covered with these little raised bumps called papillae. There are different types of papillae, and they are containing taste buds. So this is a papillae, and then they cross-sected it, and they have little taste buds inside the papillae. And inside these taste buds, we find the gustatory cells. And these are specialized receptor cells for particular chemicals that would be present on the tongue that produce a flavor response. All right, so they're responsive to various chemical stimuli. And so what you'll see is chemicals that are present in food will be on the tongue or in the nasal passage, which we'll get to here shortly. So when we're looking at the tongue, food chemicals come in, they make contact with the taste bud pores, where all the gustatory cells are located. Those make contact with those receptors. The receptors depolarize, sending a synapse, or their synapse on to the cranial nerve. So they send a signal to the cranial nerve via neurotransmitters, and that produces an action potential in this cranial nerve, and that goes on to your brain to give you the perception of taste. And there are different regions of your tongue that respond to different flavors. They have more concentrated types of papillae receptors or papillae in there, with more concentrations of different receptors that would respond to a sour or like hydrogen ions, or salty with sodium, bitter with alkaloids, umami, just in general savory foods, and sweet would be glucose. And so these regions of the tongue would have higher concentrations of those types of gustatory receptors that are sensitive to those chemicals. And so that last diagram showed smell, and so that feeds directly into what we would talk about next, which is olfaction. And so again, just like gustation, olfaction is responsive to chemical stimuli. And so you have an olfactory bulb just above the ethmoid bone, and this olfactory bulb basically contains sensory fibers. So here's our bulb. We have these sensory olfactory receptors that, once the chemical odorants pass through this mucus layer, they make contact with the olfactory receptors, eliciting neurotransmitters to be released onto the olfactory neurons. And then those olfactory neurons make contact with an olfactory tract, which is a bundle of fibers that goes on to the brain. And there's actually two different regions that will go to in the brain. So we have the chemical odorants eliciting the release of neurotransmitters in the receptors. The neurotransmitters are making an action potential in the olfactory bulb, and then thus the tract, which is that bundle of nerves. And the transmission goes on to the temporal lobe, which is your auditory cortex, your olfactory cortex, your primary olfactory cortex. And it also goes to your limbic system. And so that's why smells can become associated with long-term memory and emotional responses, because part of your limbic system is that hippocampus that we talked about last week, which is associated with memory formations and learning.